this is the ultimate battle of the gay media overseers. Bari Weiss versus Anderson Cooper. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had quite thought of that. And if you kind of go one level up, there's so many bad gays as well. So Peter Thiel and Sam Altman, we're all over the place.
Oh, we talked about Sam Altman on the podcast.
Yeah, we had an episode about him a while back.
So, Kate.
Yes.
Today we're going to be talking about media overseers. Do you know what that is?
What is that?
Those are people in the media who assert power by sacrificing others in order to benefit themselves. And often they can be a historic first, like the first gay or the first Black bureau chief or editor-in-chief or something like that.
But what happens when two media overseers lock horns with each other?
That's what we're going to find out.
So who are we canceling today?
The media overseer class.
Ooh, and we have a great guest for this one.
He's amazing.
Hey everyone, I'm Katelyn Burns.
And I'm Christine Grimaldi.
And you're listening to Cancel Me Daddy,
the show where we take a closer look at all the panic around cancel culture.
With thoughtful analysis.
And verbal shitposting.
Christine, we have a great guest today.
We sure do.
We have Steven Thrasher, who we've actually been trying to get on the show for a while.
Yeah. He's so smart and so great.
Like months ago, we talked about getting him on the show, and then we were so pleased when he reached out about his book, The Overseer Class. Mm-hmm. And he has a whole section in the book about how these overseers and the various class of people from marginalized communities operate within the media, which I don't know about you, but sounds like a heck of a Cancel Me Daddy episode.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into it. Steven, welcome to Cancel Me Daddy.
I am extremely happy to be here.
We all used to follow each other in what is now the Bad Place.
I've been having this experience as I've been out on book tour of seeing people come up on Instagram, a medium I don't particularly like using, but it's one of the ones to use now. I'm realizing, oh yeah, that's somebody. It's like when you go from elementary school to junior high to high school. And that's happened on Blue Sky a lot, but I'm finding it now again on Instagram, and it's nice to meet both mutuals I know from the old place and to virtually meet.
I used to say that I did not have a face for Instagram. I had a voice for podcasting, but now we're on YouTube, so I can't even say that.
Mm-hmm. I just wear my rotating series of Bruce Springsteen t-shirts. Hello, audience.
So, Steven, you wrote a terrific book, and we want to get into a little bit about that. We have wanted to have you on the show for a long time, but tell our audience a little bit about what your book is.
My book is called The Overseer Class, a Manifesto, and it began as a book about Black cops, and that's still a big part of it, including the beautiful cover made by an artist named Jamal Barber, who almost brought me to tears when he brought me a copy of the artwork itself when I was at Karis Books in Atlanta. And it began for me in thinking about the ways that people from marginalized backgrounds can amass their power, not by helping other people like them, but actually by hurting people like them and policing people like them. So it began about Black cops, but I started thinking about what are the ways that people from marginalized backgrounds act as police and as gatekeepers within institutions that basically perpetuate the power dynamics of those institutions, that don't bring more people like them to the table, but actually keep them out. And I'm so surprised this happened with both my books. I didn't really know what they were about until I started hearing from people what they were about. Mm-hmm. So I've traveled around. One person very succinctly told me, your first book was about the viral underclass, was about the abused, and this one's about the abusers, which I hadn't realized, but it sort of is. Mm-hmm. And then I just started thinking about, what are the different domains, the different structures that we see in society. And the major ways I came to thinking about the book were thinking about Black police officers, particularly after I was a reporter in Ferguson and had reported on many instances of white police officers killing Black people, but then realizing I was seeing Black cops everywhere and seeing gay cops everywhere. And something I thought about preparing for this podcast was, I remember getting a press release, I think I was at The Guardian at the time, that Disney was having its first ever out LGBTQ character in a Pixar movie. And it was going to be voiced by Lena Waithe, who is playing a a cop, a LGBTQ one-eyed Cyclops cop. And so this was even coming into, the animated domain. And I started then really thinking about it anew on experiences when I began writing the book that I'd had at New York University when I was a graduate student and graduating around the issue of Palestine. And then, of course, everything that's happened to me at Northwestern since, and thinking about the roles of, first I was thinking about police, and then I really started thinking about overseers, this job that originated on plantations and was primarily done by white people, but not always. They were often helped by what was called a black driver. Sometimes the overseers themselves were black. And so I started thinking about how the intimate work of supervising the work of enslaved black workers that overseers could do much better or more efficiently than the white master of the plantation could, who's not going to be out in the fields himself. It's too hot and it's too much work. But the intimacy, the relationship between the people, how that was cultivated on plantations, how that then transferred to factories with industrialization and versions of it morphed into modern corporations, is based on an intimacy, a perceived shared characteristic between the oppressed and the oppressors. And I really started reflecting on how I've experienced that in media, but particularly in academia.
Right, because a marginalized overseer can more intimately police somebody who is marginalized and lacks that kind of power.
When we look at images of Bull Connor, turning a fire hose on people, we're in the South, we are rightly have a lot of revulsion around it. And it's something that's very obviously racist. I think we perceive it as less racist when the police chief is black of a city, which is the case in I look at, in the end of the book, I look at 10 major cities in the country that have had collapses of their black population. I'm in Baltimore right now. And Baltimore has gone from, I think, being, Baltimore and DC have, gone down significantly, and yet they have completely black political classes. Los Angeles, near where I grew up, the black population is almost half of what it was when I was a kid. And when I was a kid, Mayor Tom Bradley was the mayor, and it made a certain amount of sense, understanding that was kind of the height of black political power as a voting bloc. And now they have a black mayor again, Karen Bass, but she is elected with a small black population and largely supported by PACs and people who are behind the real estate industry and behind Hollywood studios. She has an Asian, for the first time, chief of police. But it's like a very different thing to have the two of them as the face of basically ethnically cleansing Los Angeles of homeless people and many black people ahead of the 2028 Olympics. Like, the optics of it are dealt with very differently than they would be if Daryl Gates was still doing that. And we're seeing that in cities all over the country as black populations decline in urban cores and black homeless or unhoused populations increase. Having an Eric Adams, a Karen Bass, an Andre Dickens, somebody like this in the role, and having a large black police force makes it appear from a media standpoint as if there isn't as much racism going on, when structurally there's just as much racism going on, and arguably a more sinister kind or a harder to parse kind.
Yeah, I'm thinking about how in DC, Mayor Bowser just welcomed in our overlord Donald Trump to the city.
Yeah, that's a really interesting case. I keep thinking of things that happened after I closed the book. So you may recall that 2 or 3 weeks ago, Howard University had their graduation. Mayor Bowser was a guest and she was booed. This I think was actually kind of the beginning of the college graduation booing season. That's how this one's going to be remembered. I'd already written about, we can get into this later if you want, New York University, I was punished for talking about Palestine. NYU had made it so there'd be no more live graduation speeches. They would just put the students on video and show them as if it's a hostage proof of life situation at the graduations. But in many colleges around the country, particularly around the issue of so-called AI, these speakers are getting booed because what they have to offer is not popular. And the students, I think, are feeling, which is something educators should encourage, they're feeling their oats of, I'm thinking critically. I'm doing lifetime, analysis. So Mayor Bowser came to DC and she was booed. And I first saw this, Olufemi Atawu, who wrote Elite Capture. He was the person I saw first, I think, posting about this on Blue Sky. And the students were taking some heat from Howard alumni, but they were in their rights to express themselves. And they had a very substantive critique. They don't like Mayor Bowser because she had very recently been pushing a curfew bill for young Black people
She
in
sure
Washington, D.C.
has.
And please jump in because I've been going all over the country. I don't know, and if you have any updates, jump in with them. I don't know whether or not it passed, but I knew that she was pushing it. This was a core demand of the Black Lives Matter movement and of groups like B1P100. And I remember when in the summer of 2020, when BLM was in its kind of third large wave that I had covered following the murder of George Floyd and dovetailing with COVID protests, there was a huge amount of support for Black Lives Matter. Mayor Bowser painted Black Lives Matter all along one of the major avenues. But then when the BLM activists confronted her and said, yes, we want results. We want you to defund the police. We want you to reallocate police resources to mental health services and after school services. She said, absolutely not. I am not taking any money from the police, and continued to increase the police budget. And then in a lot of ways has colluded with the Trump administration. She eventually even tore up the writing of Black Lives Matter. So they have a real critique of using the optics of Black liberation, these Howard students, by someone who's co-opting them and not using them. And I think that's what they were voicing. And I think in general, college students are rebelling against the idea that they should not be expressing the things that they have just learned how to critically have thoughts about, that they're supposed to act like their heads could be opened up and have information shoved inside without anything to say about it. And I think the more that their speeches are curtailed and students aren't allowed to talk, the audience is going to speak back to the speakers when they're serving them up things they think are are worthy of being booed.
And you talk in the book about these 4 types of marginalized people in positions of power, whether that's in education and policing, in corporate America. So there's the Uncle Tom, who is the self-defeating martyr for the sake of martyrdom. And you also dispel kind of the myth of Uncle Tom that's grown over the years, that person is the overseer, whereas that person is actually sacrificing themselves for no good reason. And then there's the token, who's the figurehead without real power. There's the overseer, of course, which we've discussed. And then there's the Tony, named after Toni Morrison, who's trying to lift up other people into the existing system, or perhaps breaking the existing system open and helping other people out. I think one of my questions for the overseer class, you mentioned earlier drivers, and I was hoping you could make a little bit more of a distinction between the overseer and the driver, who I understand kind of helps the overseer enact their policies or their will. And I'm really interested, after reading this book, in where does personal agency and structural complicity begin? Because you get some really great examples about Black drivers, and you talk about the Jewish capo during the Holocaust. And so you wrote that personal intent really doesn't matter when it is upholding this power structure. And I'm curious about where the person ends and where the power structure begins.
The Uncle Tom archetype was an archetype that I was trying to rehabilitate because it has different origins to how it's evolved. When I think about overseers, I'm trying to, in fact, when I think about slavery in general in the book, I am trying to be very careful and not saying one is the same, that the modern corporation is not the same as the plantation. However, quite literally, from the management practices as the management of labor evolved from happening under a whip to happening under industrialization and the modern workplace, those techniques, it is a direct line in how those techniques developed. And so I think they're helpful for understanding how the dynamics play out now. With the drivers and the overseers, I do think in the book about the differences between somebody who doesn't have a choice about the system they're in and those who do. And one of the best questions I've gotten, again, I said, I don't really understand what my book's about till I hear other people talking about it. When I was talking with Donovan Ramsey, who wrote When Crack Was King in Atlanta, he asked me this really great question about the difference between people who are trying to survive and those who are acting from personal ambition. And I think that's a really important thing to wrestle with. I also think that mere ways to exist and survive increasingly rely on ambition. And so drivers, to go back to the plantation, were also enslaved. They don't really have a choice in what they're doing. They're not necessarily choosing it. There's historical record of people choosing to be drivers because they wanted to do harm reduction, because they wanted to be the person between the overseer and the rest of their family. And they thought, okay, I'm going to have to, use the whip sometimes, but maybe I can spare people. But with the personal intent, like they had to counteract that. The overseer would be wanting to make sure that they're not doing anything special. So then they do have to whip twice as hard or act even more cruel, which is a dynamic that I've seen in research that I've read down over decades about Black police officers. Black police officers feel very clearly that they have to be harder on Black people. And then they grow harsher on Black people than a white officer would, because they don't want their commander or their colleagues saying you're being nicer to those people because you share this affinity. And I think that there's different levels of power that people in these roles have. So Eric Adams, as an NYPD cop for 21, 22 years, he was more of a driver. He's somebody who's in the system. Eric Adams, the mayor, is an overseer. He has very clearly a position of power. He's negotiating between capital and the proletariat. We can see from the text that leaked, during the Columbia University encampment, that he was in a WhatsApp chat with billionaires, with them telling him what to do. Like, he's very clear an overseer.
How did they learn not to, put anything in the group chat that they don't want to see in the newspaper?
No, they think they're above it. Mm-hmm. And so I try to have more empathy with people who are in these driver positions. I got a beautiful letter from a woman in prison in Texas who's read both of my books in prison. She read my first book in solitary confinement. And she wrote so compassionately about viewing and understanding the Black women who are the guards in her area, who decide whether or not she gets water, whether or not she can go to the bathroom, understanding them as overseers. But she actually, much more, I think, compassionately than I have, sees them as victims of the same system, that they're also part of this system. And I think I do feel that about drivers. And I try to write with some sympathy in the book about what it means to be a trans person, recruited into the United States military, which is the largest employer of trans people on earth. And at the same time, it creates a certain amount of complicity, because I understand, like, my family's move into the middle class, such as it was because my father and my uncles went into the U.S. military. And so therefore, there's this way that we are continuously kind of being co-opted and brought into these systems that I think is worth interrogating, not always blaming. But at the same time, as I've started to, hear back on, I do name names in my book.
It's a beautiful thing to see.
And I've gotten a variety of reactions, mostly positive, about that decision. I don't mind. Like, I think there is a real tension of intent structure. I think it's something that we often think about. But when I think about this woman, her name was Quinetta, who wrote to me from prison. And she not only told me about thinking about overseers, she told me about, we got to talk on the phone once. She told me about things that the women do for each other for harm reduction, that they know, which guards are rapists, or, which ones will be trading sexual favors. And even the white girls and the Black girls who might be, they're not really gangs in prison, but there's certainly kind of a racial tribalism. Like, white girls who are racist will fake medical incidents to keep, if they see a Black girl about to be alone with one of these rapist guards. And, and like, if they can be thinking of this kind of solidarity under the incredible, oppression of life and incarceration, the dehumanizing things that it does, there is no excuse for magazine editors or television anchors or university deans to be thinking about, what can I do if I'm put in a position like that? Yeah. And so since I'm here in Baltimore, one of the examples I cite in the book of someone who chooses not to be an overseer is the painter Amy Sherald, who painted Michelle Obama and was supposed to have a big show that I think was supposed to be happening right now at the Smithsonian. And then the Smithsonian told her to take out the trans painting that's called Transforming Liberty. She painted a living subject that she knows and depicted them as the Statue of Liberty as a trans woman. And she said, no, I'm not taking the painting out. Painting's not going to the show. She brought it here in Baltimore. It's now, I think, at the High in Atlanta. But I think, people who are put in these positions of cultural power, there are moments where they can make decisions. And even though there's structural force and whatnot, there are moments where, like, they can do the right thing. And so I do want people to wrestle with intent, even though intent isn't always the thing that's going to change the structure.
I want to bring it back to the media, because you mentioned magazine editors and whatnot, and we're all media professionals here with our own experiences as marginalized people. How do these dynamics, overseer and driver and whatnot, how do you see those playing out in specifically the American media of 2026?
The first way I've seen it most over the last few years has been as a professor in a journalism school. And prior to my own entrance into the story in such a dramatic way, in 2019, I was just starting at Northwestern right before COVID. It was my only kind of normal term before everything changed. And Jeff Sessions was coming to campus. He had just left, I think, being the attorney general. And
the Keebler elf of racism.
He is the Keebler elf of racism. That's very, very well put.
That's fantastic.
And he was also at the time, I don't know if the Trump people have surpassed it in the second term, but in the first term, he was on a tear against journalistic freedom. He had set in motion more investigations trying to get journalists' phone records and those kinds of things than anybody else in American history. And so a lot of students were protesting this, and the university came down on them like a hammer. And then there was activism happening, and students in the student newspaper made a decision to take down a photo, if I'm remembering correctly, that they knew had students in the picture who could be deported, who might have been undocumented, who are participating in protests, which I thought was it's an editorial decision. It's their paper. It's independent of the university. But I also thought, in thinking about what it means to be a member of a community, student to student, was a very admirable thing to be thinking through, and not wanting to see, before everything we've seen in the last year or two, but even before that, like not wanting to see their fellow students deported, kicked out of school. And American journalism came down on them like a goddamn hammer. I'm sorry if I'm not supposed to curse on your podcast.
No, it's fine.
No, not on this podcast. You can do pretty much anything.
It was disgusting. And one of the students had a internship at the Washington Post. It was canceled. They were kicked out of it because of a decision they made as an editor. Like, editors make decisions. And so that was really telling to the students in a way that they found incredibly painful. And I think I was one of the only professors maybe they could talk to it, that they got the message. Stand up for things and you have no career. Say nothing. Accept things as they are. Don't worry about undocumented people. Don't worry about Black people. Don't worry about trans people. And your career can continue apace. So I think that's where it really begins. Journalism school is only one entry into journalism, but I think it illustrates the dynamic that people see. If you are a journalist who's taking positions on things, it's going to be very hard. Palestine up that, of course, exponentially in all kinds of ways. And then as I write in the book, before there were cell phone cameras many years ago, and one of my many odd jobs I've had, I worked at an architecture firm, and Anderson Cooper was one of our clients. And this is something I tweeted about for years. I've written about for years. I've never heard any response from him. People will sometimes say, where are the pictures? And I tell them it was in 2003, 2004. We weren't all walking around with cameras. Celebrities had a different way of being back then. But he came, and I was not a journalist. I was just kind of a news junkie and watched CNN a lot. And he came to our Christmas party, our holiday party, with an IDF sweatshirt, which I found shocking even at the time. And since then, you can see all kinds of pictures of him wearing shirts of SWAT team and this police department, that police department, U.S. military. Obviously, like, you would never see any U.S. broadcaster ever in a Hezbollah t-shirt or any foreign military other than maybe, the IDF. But that really helped me see, before I was even a journalist, that there is no such thing as objectivity. There is a collusion with state power and an understanding of when you can and cannot be in opposition to state power. And even though I'm thinking, my book, I'm very proud, it's published by amass, which is the oldest black press at one of the big publishing houses, and very much, I think, is an outgrowth of Black political thought, but also it's an outgrowth of queer theory as well, even though it's not as much in the book as in some other things that I've written. But I think a lot about how gay, not as much trans people, because I'd say it's more LGBT trans exclusionary, but you have your Caitlyn Jenners, but the way that women through imperial feminism and queer people through homonationalism can also be these overseers who are there to set the boundaries of how far people can protest or how far they can go. And so I would say, as a shorthand, a person like an Anderson Cooper And I don't know anything off the top of my head about his relationship status, so I'll take him out of the example. That kind of person could say they were happy about getting married, could celebrate gay marriage at this point. I think that's something that a news anchor could do. Could a news anchor bring up that queer people are being starved to death in Gaza on CNN?
No. Could they point out that there are no trans people on the network that they work for?
No, and it's shameful, and I've been thinking about this internationally, how there is a worldwide way that strongmen, or so-called strongmen, Putin, Trump, various places in Europe, various places in Africa that I was traveling, particularly Museveni in Uganda, where I was in the fall, where being queer, you can face the death penalty. When their back is against the wall, they have really turned to trans issues as a way to try to reinscribe patriarchy and to subjugate women of all kinds, cis and trans. It's a very common and terrifying thing around the world. And news journalists are used to sloppily and casually, standing with the American military and defending, quote unquote democracy, but not talking about what's happening to trans people and not talking about what's happening to women around the world in these ways. And I think it's really undervalued and I think from mainstream media, it's undervalued the role that liberal media has had in creating this moral panic about trans people around the world. I worked at The Guardian, and we or the UK people were 5 years ahead of this in the United States. And it just took over everything. And the same thing has happened here. And yes, there's a part of it that's conservative, although I also have personally, I'm sure you have too, Katelyn, I've also reported on people like Asa Hutchinson, Republican governors who vetoed legislation years ago. It really was the amping of the liberal, kind of center, minorly left Atlantic New York Times media in this country that whipped that moral panic. And that created a set, and those were overseers, that when an Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or whatever is not making this a central part of their issues, but maybe they are covering something like marriage, but they don't take this up, then that's doing incredible harm.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. As you're talking about this stuff, I'm thinking of the queer media people, because that's my, that's the space that I exist in. And, I'm thinking, okay, well, what role do I hold as somebody who has more of a platform than most other trans people? I get published at MS Now, which used to be MSNBC. They have stopped asking me to come on TV. Maybe my jokes are too edgy, I don't know. But then I think about the time that CNN had very brief discussions with me about becoming a regular on-air talent on contract, which is a very prestigious thing, would have helped my career immensely. And then they backed out of it and they stopped answering my emails. So you talk about Anderson Cooper, you mentioned Caitlyn Jenner. Well, Caitlyn Jenner, to my knowledge, is the only trans person on any American news network that has a paid on-air contract. And it's with Fox News. And it's because she's explicitly willing to back up the conservative viewpoint on trans issues, even though she's out here going, oh, President Trump, my passport now says male. Can you help me? And it's like, no, he's not going to help you, honey. And you got him there. I don't know that I have a specific question in all of this, but God, I relate to this.
One of the things I'm trying to do in the book, and I try to hold myself accountable and think about the times I've been seduced or the decisions I've made. But I want to acknowledge that the pressure is always there. And even when you can get over it, there's a toll. So if I think about, obviously, those of us have been punished in very explicit ways around Palestine or trans rights or whatever it may be, you can see it. There are people who also do it and you don't see their punishment. But even the act of going through it takes up so much psychic energy, not to mention, money for therapy and lawyers or whatever else is needed, that keeps you from doing other work. So even if, and I really love the work that you've been doing, Katelyn, what you wrote about Juniper Blessing was really gorgeous. But even, and I shouldn't, well, this is a question for you. Okay. I won't try to project it. Do you think that even having to think about the CNN contract and what you can say or couldn't say, takes up your time and energy very differently than if you were just hired to do the job and told you have free reign to talk about whatever you want.
Yeah, and even now, I still self-censor, and I've talked about this on the show before. I am not all that comfortable commenting about Israel-Palestine. It's not because I don't have strong feelings about it, but a lot of it is that I'm, an Irish Catholic New Englander. At the end of the day, my opinion doesn't matter all that much, I think, in the grand scheme of things. But at the same time, it's like, why would I take that risk? I have a very tenuous career as it is.
Yeah.
And why would I risk it? And I have been punished, like you said, for being very outspoken. I have walked up to and probably crossed the line into advocacy several times in my career, although I've never self-identified as an activist. And it's always been in the name of news analysis or opinion writing. But I am fully aware of consequences. Like, there's a reason why I only do opinion work now and I stopped doing serious reporting. And it's because I couldn't take that neutral tone that they want you to continue allowing you to do straight news reporting.
The neutrality part of it is it's just bullshit, to be honest about it. And at the journalism school, which I am still technically on faculty of, but they had given their annual Courage Award to Ukrainian journalists in May of 2023. And part of the citation was not only for their journalism, but that they were helping protect women and children and get people into civilian shelters. They've never acknowledged Palestinian journalists, even though, 270 plus have been killed so far. So it's not just about objectivity. And the same thing around trans rights. They will sort of accept the status quo without stepping out about it. And it's something that is an ongoing debate in journalism for a long time, but I've certainly seen a lot more ire about it in the past few years. And people know that they're rewarded when they don't say anything. I always, and seems like a good podcast to tell the story. When I was at the Village Voice, I'd already had one run in writing about Israel, but then there was like this community story that was so juicy. And it had everything. Michael Lucas, the pornographer with a 9-inch dick, which is a telling detail that we had to fact check in my book.
Yes.
Because he would send porn of himself to reporters, including me, when we were writing about it. So he decided, he heard there was an Israel supporting group at the LGBT Center and he wanted them out. And at the time, the LGBT Center was incredibly low key compared to what so many, I think, in an obscene way, LGBT centers have become, that are these donor playgrounds. But, any community group could meet in the space. This group was marching in the Pride Parade, and they went to rent a room to organize their group that was going to be in the Pride Parade. He wanted them out. This story had everything any reporter on the island of Manhattan could ever want from a story. It had a Zionist pornographer with a 9-inch dick. It had charges of Islamophobia. It had charges of anti-Semitism. It had the age-old debate of public money versus private money. The First Amendment, is it the city council that sets the First Amendment? Is a donor that sets? Nobody wrote about it except for me and one reporter at Gay City News. That was it.
Wow.
And that's because, why would you risk your whole career for that?
Right.
But then what happens is the self-censorship becomes that there are very important things that people aren't weighing in on. And I thought that that's become really important when we've seen, say, at the international level, the level of people who otherwise write about security or write about, and they're not suddenly having anything to say about Israel and Palestine. And then here in the United States, where we see people who will write about the civil rights movement in the 1960s because it's in the past, they're less likely to say stuff about the real erosion of the Voting Rights Act now. And they have nothing to say about the fact that trans people are being pushed out of bathrooms in quite similar dynamics that they were in the 1960s. One of my longtime thinking partners, in particular for my first book, was Lewis Wallace, who was fired for being a trans reporter, that just acknowledged, if I'm going on assignment to one of these states and the cis reporter can use one bathroom and I can use another, there's no objectivity for either one of us. We are both complicit in agreeing to this being okay as the status quo unless we say something. But it's not only on me or Lewis saying, as the trans person, just as in the 1960s, whether a black reporter or a white reporter went to the South, it's not only the black reporter's responsibility to say, I can't use the bathroom. The white reporter is just as complicit in not being able to use the bathroom. And now we have trans people being unpersoned with their documents in states. Fortunately, there looks like there have been some good legal wins, but there are lots of people acting like this is a neutral position. And it's not. It's just accepting that they are not impacted by the status quo in a way that they're going to let go. And journalism generally rewards that, at least paying journalism.
I'll give you another story that nobody is covering, and it's trans-related, and it's about the internal refugee crisis where red state trans people are fleeing to blue states. That has been reported very thoroughly. I think really good job. Like that has broken through with reporters who aren't trans. But the story now is they get to these cities and the cities don't have resources for them.
Yeah.
And they can't find jobs.
Yeah. I got to report in South Africa and Uganda, and something I found so interesting, particularly in South Africa, was that Europeans and North Americans are continuously terrified of African refugees, even though literally the only refugees being admitted from the whole world right now to the United States are white South Afrikaners. That's it. Nobody else. But on the continent of Africa, actually, most migration happens south. Queer Africans who are fleeing sexuality persecution, gender persecution, actually try to get to South Africa because on paper, the South African Constitution has the best legal rights in the world. However, when they arrive, they actually find that there is an enormous amount of xenophobia around just being migrants. And that is something that's not being covered at all as well. And fits into, I think, what you're bringing up, Katelyn, as well, is that when people have to move because they can't survive where they are, there are resources, but they are not being given to people. Yeah. And as the climate warms or as people need to flee various kinds of persecution, there needs to be a welcoming ethos. And overseers can play a role at a governmental level, at a media level, of whether or not that welcoming is happening. And it's really heartbreaking when you see, in South Africa, an out gay politician who has been on the forefront of gay rights within South Africa, but then doesn't want to welcome other queer Africans because they are foreign, quote unquote foreigners. And this is the dynamic that I'm trying to highlight in the book and thinking about what different decisions could we make? How can we see containers of alliance that are not sort of me as a queer person thinking I should be aligned with Corinne Jean-Pierre because she's the first lesbian press secretary, and rather understanding, well, maybe I should be aligned with, if I'm a queer person living in New York, maybe I need to be welcoming queer people from Texas, or maybe I need to be helping queer Afghanis resettle who've come here. Like, there are other ways that we can see our affiliation that are more horizontal and go across borders, rather than seeing our first affiliation need to be with the people overseeing us.
Well, and the media overseers aren't just adhering to the status quo. They're also setting the status quo, right? They're kind of in charge of the Overton window. You talk about it in the book. There's consensus, controversy, and deviance. And what was once deviant becomes maybe a controversy where it's able to be debated. You talk about this with same-sex marriage. Where do you see the Overton window shifting these days, particularly on Palestine? I was surprised and somewhat happy to see that the New York Times published an opinion piece by Chris Van Hollen saying that it's time for the Democratic Party to stop pledging fealty to AIPAC and Israel.
I definitely think in the time I've reported on this issue, which I first did in 2010 or 11, so about 15 years, there's been a huge shift in the kind of debate. And I had a wonderful editor named Mort Harkavy, who unfortunately died of COVID. I wrote about him in the Viral Underclass. He was one of the most formative editors I've had. Jewish American. I didn't even have the word for this at the time, but I would have thought of him as anti-Zionist, was very critical of the idea of Israel, but told me in quasi early internet years, he's like, you need to start reading Haaretz and reading English language press in Israel, because you're going to see that the debate of what the boundaries of debate about what Israel should be doing is far wider than it is in New York City. And he was totally correct. Like you could see people, Israelis saying, we need to dissolve Israel. It needs to be one state where everybody has, democratic rights, all the way to the farthest right of the Likud party. But within the New York media sphere, it was a very, very narrow band of what was being allowed to be said. So in the course of my career, I feel good about how the Overton window has widened within mainstream media with a plethora of other media. And the public opinion has only shifted in one direction. And the biggest jumps we see are within Jewish communities by age. You get the younger you get, the more overwhelmingly critical these responses are. But after October 7th happened and people began to get their head around what had actually happened and what the likely response was going to be, the first poll, I think it actually was MSNBC or NBC, but one of the first polls showed a majority of Democratic voters said we should not be giving more resources to Israel. I was shocked. And that's only continued to climb into higher levels of power. Where I feel pretty disappointed and worried is that none of that has translated into policy and making the bomb stop. But I'm old enough to remember, and it was both a beautiful and a difficult experience going to South Africa and seeing a country that had lived so large in my imagination, because my parents, who never left the US, were quite involved in the grassroots anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. And like, eventually that system left. Now, on paper, lots of bad things. There's a big gap between the paper post-apartheid South Africa and the lived reality. But the system did fall. And part of that was shifting public opinion. And the Overton window has shifted. And it's not, it's not going to go back. I do think there'll be more brutal repression within media and government. And Israel just announced they're spending a huge more amount of money. But in a way you can't, once people started seeing person to person what was happening to their peers, even if you change the algorithm on TikTok or Instagram, people have now seen it. And I think that's another reason why when I look over the course of my life, when Gulf War I started, it was 91% approval from the American people. And it was something like 20 when Iran began. The American people are increasingly not for military intervention. Unfortunately, we don't have a one-to-one democracy of what our will is to what happens. But in terms of the Overton window and the ideas that have gone through and an openness to new forms of being, that is all positive. And I think as someone who's covered social movements, and Katelyn, I take seriously too kind of the distinction between being an activist or a journalist. You can still be a journalist and have a point of view, but we're still doing rigorous work. And sometimes your communities are fucking pissed off at you.
Yeah.
What you report. But I certainly think when I look at covering Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, gay rights movements, the BLM in various stages up to 2020 and COVID, and No Kings and all these things, some that are more centrist. That's how we wind up at a point where the Minneapolis response is so broad, responding against ICE, that you have an entire city kind of working in coalition and thinking about the harm and the protection of their neighbors. And all of that's beautiful, which doesn't mean that ICE isn't still terrorizing people. But certainly over the course of my career, I just see a broadening and widening concept of care for one another that is only going in one direction and keeps seeding new and better possibilities.
Do you think that people are seeing that the status quo is no longer acceptable in the mainstream media? I think back to the Anderson Cooper example, and he just left 60 Minutes. He is getting a lot of praise for that because it's seen as a rebuke of David Ellison, the billionaire who owns the channel, and Bari Weiss, the editor-in-chief of CBS News. But Anderson Cooper has reinforced some really mediocre to harmful reporting over the years. Are people seeing a change? Are they ready for a change? Are they demanding change?
This is the ultimate battle of the gay media overseers. Bari Weiss versus Anderson Cooper. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't quite thought of that. And then if you kind of go one level up, there's so many bad gays as well. So Peter Thiel and Sam Altman, we're all over the place.
Oh, we talked about Sam Altman on the podcast.
Yeah, we had an episode about him a while back.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly find, Katelyn, you said something that was very important. Like, we're hustling. We have to hustle to do what we do.
Yeah.
And that is difficult.
Yeah.
And I think that a difference between journalism and some other forms of writing is that you do need some sustained resources. You need some structure. To me, the saddest thing about CBS News going downhill isn't just a kind of pie in the sky memory of its coverage of the Vietnam War, but it's that I've met many journalists who worked at CBS or, in staff jobs where you get to make the news every day. And then they go on to work at Democracy Now! Or they go on to, to do their own Substack or whatever, but and so there's very little entry level ability for people to learn those skills. But I do think people want different things. They respond very well to my writing. You see that when people can figure out the economics, when Deadspin was basically killed by its VC overlords and then they created Defector, like they're doing very well.
Yeah.
People don't like to be bullshitted and they seek things out. I think to me, the biggest tactical challenge right now is there's an audience for the kind of news that we want to create, but understanding how to coalesce it financially is very difficult. Everyone can't have their own Substack. Everyone can't have their own podcast. Like we need some coalition together and we need some infrastructure so that everyone's not worried, where am I going to pay my rent next month? But I certainly think the audience is there. And we saw a huge hunger for it. In 2020, we saw enormous hunger for it. In the paperback of my book, The Viral Underclass, I write with sadness of seeing a window of possibility closing because people were incredibly open-hearted and open-minded in 2020. And some of that lives on. I sensed from people who worked in offices who were suddenly working remotely at home. I saw so many more people engage in mutual aid than ever had before. And they were very happy. Like I knew many office workers who yes, I like making a Google Doc or a Google Sheet to figure out, there are 3 women over 80 in our apartment building. And, these are the people who are going to go buy their grocery. Like people like doing stuff like that. They enjoy it. It feels good. And the good seeds that come out of that is why you see a broad response in Minneapolis, because people have had this experience. They're like, yes, we're going to figure out, okay, there are undocumented people working in our neighborhood. We need to organize grocery runs. We'll do it. And people do it. So that's the good side of it. But we're really struggling to figure out how to keep a critical mass of critical journalism happening in this way because there are just resource needs.
It does harden me, though, that the audience is there for it. I just think back to the election and, couldn't criticize Biden, couldn't criticize Harris because otherwise Donald Trump would win. And obviously we can talk about different levels of harm reduction for different communities. But I think that there was just this real animus towards anybody who dared criticize the status quo. But we need to be doing that in addition to criticizing the strongmen like you talked about. We need to be demanding better for ourselves and our communities.
There are losses and there are wins that have happened in the dynamic. I do think the repudiation of Harris or of the Biden-Harris kind of campaign, because he had most of that time, shows that there is a substantive desire to say we have red lines. There are red lines that we will not cross. And the Democratic coalition, the leadership of the Democratic coalition has acted quite disrespectfully in saying there are no red lines that we will not break and expect our coalition to stay together. The right doesn't do that. They have their red lines. And it's disappointing, if not surprising, to finally see this DNC autopsy come out, not even dealing with these issues. But then you have these races in Seattle and, of course, Mamdani in New York City, where coalitions have come around saying, yes, we are critical about Israel. Yes, we stand by trans rights. Yes, we demand affordability. And we're not going to say it's just, it's Andrew Cuomo or it's not, the analogy doesn't even really work exactly, but it did hearten me to see so many people stand by their values and win. And, and we need to see that. And I've been really interrogating myself in conversation with other, particularly Black journalists and book writers, about what it means to think about overseers in the death spiral of the Voting Rights Act. And I do actually think it's more important than ever to demand that the elected representatives represent our issues, our interests, and don't give them a pass. And there's a handful of times where you can see it, where it's not even a conflict about race or identity. In St. Louis and Ferguson, where I reported for many years, we now have Wesley Bell versus Cori Bush. And Cori Bush was an activist that was in and around Ferguson, was homeless at one point, was in Congress, was really taken out by AIPAC money. And I feel very grateful that we have this opportunity to, those voters have a chance to interrogate 2 Black candidates. One has gotten almost $14 million from AIPAC, the other one $0. And here's a way that this can actually be thought about without reducing it to just the factor of race, because they're both Black candidates.
Yeah.
I also would just share very briefly that when I was in Africa, it was really both Uganda and South Africa, it was really interesting hearing from people asking, why are you even thinking about Black police or an affinity. Like everybody here is Black. So why would I think I was aligned with a cop? And that was a really interesting way for me to like come back to the States and realize, yeah, if we're in a multiracial democracy, why would I assume an allegiance with people whose job is primarily to maintain the status quo?
Katelyn, do you have any other questions?
No, I was going to ask him to plug his book one more time.
Yes, please do. Please.
Yeah, the book is called The Overseer Class. It's out from Amistad Books, and it's available anywhere books are sold. I do the audiobook, and I've really appreciated not only people buying it, but requesting it at their libraries. And I've certainly, now that I've had a first book out, The Viral Underclass, for a few years, I really appreciate seeing and knowing that it's still circulating in libraries. So yeah, my plug would be, of course, I'm happy when people buy my book, but something free you can do is just to ask your library to get it so that you can share it with your community. And I am so grateful to finally get to talk to both of you. I really admire your work and glad we have re-established contact from the dark website.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
I will just say we have affiliate links with bookshop.org. So we will have a link wherever you're listening to this, listener, go into the description or the show notes and you will see a link to buy Steven's great book.
Thank you so much. And if people are listening in New York City, BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, is hosting a week-long film retrospective based on my book called Black Cops, Spies, and Overseers. And we'll be showing 12 movies that I write about the book from June 5th to 11th.
Oh, man, we didn't even get into The Heat of the Night, which was when he tries to shake down, or he does shake down the Black illegal abortion worker. And I got particularly mad as an abortion journalist. I was like, come on.
Yes.
Yeah.
That to me, I was disturbed by how good in The Heat of the Night is. It's a fantastic movie, which shows how, the propaganda you like is the most effective.
Indeed.
But that scene, more than any other that I can think of that I wrote about, explains why there are Black cops.
Wow.
Because he's the only one that can go to the other side of town and worm his way in and threaten something that is a vital necessity to that community and personally threaten that person to get the information out of them they need, which is really the dynamic of what these overseers do.
Well, thank you so much, Steven. We should have you on again sometime, I think.
I would love it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then in that same chapter, there are 5 principles of the social doctrine of the church. So I'm going to run down those because I think this is where things get a little trickier.
Okay.
The first is the common good. That's great. We love the common good. The second is the universal destination of goods. Ensure technologies are not concentrated in the hands of only a few people. So this kind of goes back to our Sam Altman episode, right? And how we really need to be concerned that AI is really being developed by a billionaire bro class. And then the rest of us are told that like this is the only way we can survive in the future.
Yeah. I don't know. My head is empty. The Pope hat goes on and all the thoughts just go right at the top. See, there's a hole in the top. I don't know if you can see it.
That's where the thoughts like just come out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a little steam engine. You can't see the steam coming out from
Nice.
my brain running. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to the show this week. And actually, Christine, Steven said something that made me think. Can you guess what it is?
I do, Kate. It's about bringing media together and how we can support each other collectively.
And so this is our chance to tell you about Christine and I's trust fund bundle. And what is that, you might ask? Well, Christine and I both have newsletters, and you can become a paid subscriber to both for one low rate. So you can become a paid subscriber to both Christine and I's newsletter for just $5.50. The link is in the description. Check that out.
Burns Notice meets Vendetta.
I love the name of your newsletter.
Thanks, Kate.
Cancel Me Daddy is a Flytrap media production, and today's show was made by me, Caitlin Burns, and my incredible co-host, Christine Grimaldi, along with our editor, May Schultz.
Dee Peterschmidt made our theme song, and Romy Tirico designed our graphics. Transcriptions by Heather Lengefeld. Our thumbnails are made by Sarah at bursty.com. That's BURSSTY.com. Ads by Multitude Productions.
Our show is made possible by the incredible cancelers supporting our work, especially the member of our Canceler Hall of Fame, with the great power to cancel all of their enemies. Meg.
We appreciate your support.
Happy canceling.